Today, we're diving into a really thought-provoking piece of analysis called Double Standards, a tale of two UN responses. It gets into some pretty tough questions about how global institutions react during a crisis. So let's jump right in.
So, to kick things off, the source we're looking at starts with this really interesting quote from a satirical piece. "You have bombs, so you will use them. I am here, everything will be fine, my child." Now, even though it's satire, it does an amazing job of framing what we're about to explore. Themes of power, of perception, and maybe what feels like a kind of paternalistic view of global events.
All right, so this all boils down to what the source calls a tale of two very different crises.
So what's this really all about? Well, the piece we're exploring basically puts two events in Iran side by side. On one hand, you have the government's internal crackdown on its own protesters, and on the other, you have external military strikes against that same regime. The whole argument hinges on comparing the UN's reaction to each one.
Okay, this timeline is super important. It's really the backbone of the whole argument. So look at the dates. Protests kick off on December 28th. Just a little over a week later, the regime shuts down the internet. Then, almost 2 full months go by, and on February 28th, the airstrikes happen. The timing of the UN's response to all of this is absolutely crucial, so try to keep these dates in your head.
Okay, so we've got our timeline. Now the big question is, how did the UN's top leadership, the people at the very top, respond to these two very different events?
Let's start at the very top with Secretary General Guterres. The source points out that when the strikes happened, boom, he condemned them right away. It also highlights his use of the word retaliation for Iran's countermoves, which some might say lends them legitimacy. But what about the internal crackdown on protesters? Well, the source claims there was public silence through the violence, through the internet blackout, and then, much later, just an expression of shock at reports of violence. The wording is key here.
And we're not talking about a small delay here. The source puts a number on it, and it's a big one. 14. 14 full days of public silence from the Secretary General while the regime was cracking down on its own citizens.
And the source argues this wasn't a one-off. It claims we see a really similar pattern with the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk. An immediate statement, deploring the strikes, and again using that word retaliatory for Iran's response. But for the internal crackdown, silence during the internet blackout, and then, only after the killing started, a statement saying he was deeply disturbed by reports. And his delay, the source clocks it at 12 days. Think about that, 12 days before the UN's top human rights official publicly said anything about the crackdown.
Okay, so that's the leadership. But what about the agencies on the ground? The specialized parts of the UN. Let's see how they reacted.
Let's take UNICEF, for example, the UN's Children's Fund. After the strikes, it was quick to express concern for children in Iran. But the source puts this right next to its response to the internal crackdown, claiming UNICEF was silent for 2 whole weeks, even while reports were coming out that the regime was killing protesters, including hundreds of kids.
The source then turns to UN Women, and the contrast it draws is, wow, it's pretty stark. For the strikes, the language was strong, gravely concerned about the safety of women and girls. But for the crackdown, where women and girls were specifically being targeted, the source points to 26 days of silence, followed by a much more general tweet saying, women in Iran have experienced enough violence.
Let that number just sink in for a second. 26. 26 days. That's how long the source says UN Women waited to publicly say something about the violent crackdown on women protesters. All right, so we've looked at the top brass and the big agencies. Now the source takes us another layer down to a group of people known as independent experts. So who are these folks? They're called special rapporteurs. Basically, they're independent human rights pros, not tied to any government, and their job is to report on specific issues or countries. Their independence is what's supposed to give their voice so much weight. And the source really hones in on the special rapporteur for counterterrorism, Ben Saul, as a kind of case study. The picture it paints is pretty dramatic. On the very same day as the military strikes, he allegedly blasted out multiple posts condemning them as aggression. But for the internal crackdown on protesters, the article claims a staggering 54-day silence before he even co-signed a statement about it. 54 days. We're talking almost 2 full months here. The source uses this number, the longest delay we've seen yet, to make a really powerful point about what it sees as skewed priorities.
And according to the source, this wasn't an outlier. The piece argues that when you look at other independent experts, you see a similar story playing out again and again. Swift, strong words for the external strikes, and then for the internal crackdown, either complete silence or really long delays.
Okay, so when you start pulling all these different pieces together, from the Secretary General all the way down to these experts, what's the bigger picture here? Well, the source argues that a very clear pattern of response starts to take shape. And really, when you just put these two sets of reactions right next to each other, the source says the difference becomes impossible to ignore.
So here it is. This is the core of the entire argument, all laid out in one place. Look at the left column, immediate, strong reactions to the strikes. Now look at the right, delay after delay for the crackdown that started weeks earlier. 14 days, 12 days, 26 days, and that huge 54-day gap. The visual here really tells the whole story that the source is trying to get across.
So what's the bottom line? At the end of the day, the source's central argument is that this isn't just a coincidence. It claims these starkly different responses, in both timing and tone, add up to what it calls a clear double standard. And the source wraps up its case with this really powerful, direct quote. The UN body established to investigate the regime's atrocities against protesters chose instead to condemn the only effort aimed at weakening the regime responsible for those atrocities. That's a very strong claim, and it pretty much sums up the entire perspective of the piece.
And so, this whole analysis, this tale of two UN responses, it kind of leaves us with a much bigger, much tougher question, right? For a massive global body like the United Nations, what does being fair actually look like day to day? And maybe more importantly, who gets to be the judge?